So let's get to the first category of distortions that I call one-sided. Things that are left out of the presentation altogether. You know, if you were to watch Al Gore's film, you might think that the only thing that fossil fuels are good for is creating what Al Gore calls global warming pollution. He never once mentions the fact that maybe fossil fuels had something to do with the Industrial Revolution and the fantastic increase in prosperity that we've seen over the last 2 centuries, especially the last century. By one estimate, in the 20th century, world GDP increased by 1,800%. Just think about that, 1,800%. That would not have been possible without ever-increasing supplies of affordable energy. And what did it make possible in turn? Well, the average life expectancy worldwide has doubled in the last century. There are almost 4 times as many people living today as there were in the year 1900, and yet per capita food supplies have increased. Phenomenal improvements in medicine, in literacy, in leisure. We've basically all been, in the prosperous West, been emancipated from backbreaking toil, all right? And the question is, would any of that have been possible but for these fossil fuels that Al Gore depicts solely as sources of global warming pollution? He also doesn't ever mention the ecological benefits of the carbon dioxide that results when these fossil fuels are combusted. Literally thousands of scientific experiments show that when you enrich the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, plants, all plants, trees especially, but also crops, and just about all other forms of plant life grow faster, stronger, they become more water efficient, they become more resistant to environmental stresses like pollution or drought. So this is also a topic that's never covered anywhere in An Inconvenient Truth. We see an Inconvenient Truth a lot about the Arctic and how the polar ice cap at the North Pole is shrinking, and indeed it is. But one of the parts of this story that Al Gore never tells us is that Arctic climate is naturally very variable. One of the slides I'm showing you here shows a history of Arctic temperature over the last 100 years or so, and what you'll see there is that in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Arctic was as warm or warmer than it was at the end of the 20th century. And yet, about 70% of the extra CO2 put into the atmosphere by industrial activity occurred after 1940. So there is a high degree of natural variability in Arctic climate. That also is never mentioned. If we go back further in time, we're right now within a period in geologic time called the Holocene. It's a period between ice ages. If we go back to the early to mid-Holocene, we find that Arctic temperatures were much warmer than they are today. In fact, the whole world was warmer than it is today, which raises another question, which is how much of a crisis, how much of a planetary emergency can the warming that we're presently experiencing be if thousands of years ago the world was much warmer than it is now, and without benefit of rising carbon dioxide levels, just all on its own? And remember, folks, that those folks living 5,000 to 9,000 years ago didn't have much in the way of technology. Those were our Stone Age ancestors. And earlier climate historians used to look back at that period and call it the Holocene climate optimum. Why? Not just because it was the warmest, but because they thought it was the best, that it actually helped those primitive peoples to survive and develop the rudiments of civilization. And yet now we, with our technology, are supposed to quake and tremble and think that we're in the midst of a planetary emergency when the world is still not as warm as it was back then. It doesn't make sense to me, but that's part of the one-sidedness of Al Gore's film. Another point that I would bring up in the one-sided category, Al Gore starts his discussion of mountain glaciers with this photograph, this before and after scene of Mount Kilimanjaro. And he wants you to think that global warming has done this to this pretty glacier. We used to have this wonderful snow-capped peak, and then all of a sudden most of the snow is gone, and global warming is to blame. Well, there are at least half a dozen scientific studies out there that dispute the link between the shrinking snows of Kilimanjaro and global warming. What happened was around 1880, before mankind could have had much of anything to do with global climate, there was a local regime shift in the climate of East Africa from a relatively moist climate to a dry climate. So what happens when you get that kind of change from moist to dry? Well, there is less cloud cover to shield the glacier from sunlight, so the ice evaporates, and then there's less snowfall to replace the vanishing ice. And just incidentally, at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, it's always below freezing, so global warming isn't melting that glacier. And what I'm getting at here is that there is a lot of natural variability also in the behavior of mountain glaciers, and that's another side of the story that is conveniently left out of an inconvenient truth. If you see an inconvenient truth, one of the probably what will strike you the most, or what you will remember best, is the scene after scene of devastation from extreme weather events, from hurricanes, from floods, droughts, hailstones, tornadoes, you name it. Al Gore makes you think that it's dangerous to walk outside your house in the morning because you might get clobbered by a tornado. Okay, now this graph that I'm showing you here shows you mortality rates and aggregate mortality related to extreme weather going back to the 1920s. And what you find is that not only are mortality rates declining, in other words, the number of people per thousand or per million who die because of extreme weather, but even aggregate mortality has declined by about 95%. Think of that. The world population today is almost 4 times what it was back at the start of this chart, and yet aggregate mortality related to extreme weather has plummeted. That shows that the world is becoming a safer place in relation to extreme weather, not the reverse. That's a side of the story Al Gore would never tell.